Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
In 1989, we detected a faint call coming from the depths of the ocean. A strange cry from a massive creature, traveling alone in the vast blue waters below. At first, it sounded like an oddity, a malfunctioning hydrophone. But then we heard it again in 1990 and 1991. With only 5% of the ocean explored, it baffled us. To any untrained ear, it sounded like a whale, but its pitch was too high. Measuring at a frequency of 52 Hz, it meant that the song couldn't be understood by any known species of whale. Thus, it was destined to exist on its own, and has been dubbed the loneliest creature in the world. We called him Blue 52. Every year we'd hear the lonesome whale, measured through hydrophones spread across the west coast of America and Canada. Still, it wouldn't be until 2019 before we finally lay eyes upon it. Our crew was tasked with finding him, tagging him with a tracker, and observing for others like him. On board the RV Song of Solitude, we traversed the North Pacific in search of a whale that had been heard, but never seen. With technology constantly advancing, tracking it had become a much easier task. While it took us weeks just to locate him, we grew closer with each passing day. "Do you think he knows?" Rita asked as we stared out at the horizon. The ocean was calm, gently rocking our large research vessel. It was wonderfully peaceful, and though our mission was interesting, it carried an undeniable hint of dread. "Knows what?" I asked. She sighed. "That there are others like him out there?" It was a fair question. Whether or not the strange frequency of its voice was caused by a deformity, or if it was a hybrid species, it had to have been raised by someone. Whale calves stay approximately 1 year with their mothers, as they grow and get ready to face the oceans alone. I don't know. Why else would he sing? The whale had been traveling in the same path as blue whales, yet the timing was off. It meant that despite it going exactly the same way, it would never meet anyone else on its journey. Wherever he swam, the others would be long gone. 40 years alone, just looking for someone else. She trailed off. Weeks passed as we searched, and in the late summer of 2019, we finally found him. There it was, surfacing for a breath of fresh air. An 80-feet-long whale, spurting a fountain of water from his blowhole. He had a magnificent blue color, yet the shape of his body resembled that of a fin whale. Our theory of it being a hybrid had been confirmed, and he looked extraordinarily healthy considering that he had survived on his own for so long. "He's magnificent!" Rita exclaimed in excitement. Without hesitation, we planted a tracker on his skin with a suction cup, and let him dive back beneath the ocean. We went to work and recorded more of his song, a somber tune of melancholy. We spent the next 3 weeks just tracking him, hoping to see another of his kind. Alas, he remained alone. During the nights, I often found Rita staring out at the ocean, marking each time he surfaced to breathe. "He looks sad." "How can you tell?" I asked. "I don't know, just a gut feeling, I guess. Poor Eros." "Eros?" "Yeah, I figured we're the closest thing he has to a family. We ought to be the ones naming him." I mulled over the name for a moment. It certainly sounded better than Blue 52. A bit ironic, though, don't you think? "Not at all." As the mission went on, Rita started sleeping less and less. She was afraid that we'd lose Eros if we didn't keep a constant eye on him. Whales hardly ever sleep, constantly needing to resurface, always on the move. Of all the mammals, they have the lowest requirement for sleep. We were 2 months into our mission when I was shook awake in the middle of the night. As I opened my heavy eyes, I saw Rita standing above me with a wide smile on her face. "There's another! Another whale!" she shouted. We rushed to the control room where Captain Banks stood, eyes fixed on a new set of frequencies. Sure enough, there were two distinct but similar sources of sound coming from about 1,000 feet below. I knew it! I knew Eris wasn't alone! Suddenly our depressing job had turned to one of joy. If there were two, we could assume with high probability that there were more. In fact, we might have been witnessing the beginning of a new subspecies of whale. It was a beautiful moment to behold. You sure it's not a malfunction? One of the crew members asked. I looked at the numbers. Eros's voice had lowered a bit in his later years, at 50 Hz, while the other, new source, was slightly higher pitched. Could it be a calf? No idea, the sonar isn't picking anything up. We need to get closer. We waited until morning and tried to get closer to Eros. According to the sonar readings, there was a creature roughly twice the size of our whale, swimming a couple of thousand feet beneath the surface. Even for a whale, it was huge. About an hour passed, and we finally caught Eros coming up for air. Despite tracking two distinct beings, only one of them ever breached the surface. Do you see anything? I asked. No, it's not coming up. Are we sure it's a whale? What else could it be? I don't know, but even whales can't hold their breath forever. We discussed the possibility of a new species entirely, but before we can even alert our superiors back on the mainland, we heard something else. It was a third song, then a fourth and a fifth, and before long a whole pod of these creatures had been detected. They were massive, far larger than any known creature to occupy the ocean. It was a frightening but intriguing discovery. We were ordered to send down a submersible drone to get an actual view of the beings. I controlled the machine as it quickly descended down 1,000 feet. We held our breaths as the light of the sun gave way to the darkness of the ocean. Before long, we'd be right on top of the unidentified animals. Where the hell are they? Captain Banks asked. There, I saw something. It was Eros, diving down to follow the drone. He seemed to understand that the device belonged to us, and started leading us toward the other creatures. We followed Eros down further, 2,000 feet below the surface, before we finally found them. At first, all we saw were yellow, glowing orbs dangling in the darkness. Then, we saw the true monstrosities we'd discovered. They're not whales, Rita gasped. They looked like torn pieces of bright green flesh, blobbing up and down like jellyfish through the water. They had massive bodies, covered in glowing blisters. Dozens of tendrils reached out from their mangled mass. What we assumed to be their heads had multiple dark holes with thin membranes through which they emitted their songs. What are they? I asked. Before my question could be answered, one of the crew members shouted out in protest. All we heard was a splash as someone dropped into the water. Wait, no! He shouted. What happened? Captain Banks asked. Simon, he just took an anchor and jumped off the ship. We peeled our eyes in a hopeless search for the lost sailor, but he was long gone. Call the mainland. Tell them what happened, Captain Banks ordered. Get the drone back up. It's time to leave. I glanced back at the screen. The camera had gone dark, and we'd lost contact with the drone. With little hesitation, we decided to set course for the coast. The footage would serve as enough documentation of our discovery. We were still days away from reaching land, but we didn't have any other choice. Nightfall came and plunged us into overwhelming darkness. Nothing but 1,000,000 stars above to keep us lit up in the night. Despite their beauty, they signified the immense size of emptiness surrounding us. What do you think we just saw? I asked the captain. He looked over the multiple recordings we'd got from our hydrophones. They all matched the voice of Eros in terms of frequency, yet their rhythm seemed completely off. Whale songs can travel 100 miles, no problem. Based on the composition of these things, I'd say they were airless creatures. It would suggest they had come from the very depths of the ocean beneath us, but I can't say for sure. You think Eros alerted them with his voice? He nodded. Why else would they venture this far up? Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of an anchor moving on deck. We rushed outside to find Rita standing by the edge, staring longingly into the ocean below. Rita, what are you doing? They're calling for me. Who? The dancers of the sea. Their songs are so beautiful. Don't you hear them? Rita, please step away from the edge, Captain Banks begged. I took a slow step towards her, ready to snatch her away from the edge. But before I could even get close, she just stepped over and fell into the water. Rita! I shouted in despair as she sank out of sight. By the time we could even turn around to search for her, she'd be too far gone to rescue. Anyone that willingly jumped into the depths could never be rescued. Captain Banks jumped onto the radio, getting ready to demand an airlift back to the mainland. Yet the only sounds that greeted us on the other end was the damn song from the depths. Whatever these creatures were, they interfered with our system, making it impossible to call for help. We were effectively trapped. On the ocean, 100 glowing orbs appeared. The creatures, despite coming from thousands of feet below, had the ability to surface, and they were heading straight for us. Oh God, there was all I could get out before the ship shook violently. A tendril reached out from the water and grabbed onto one of the crewmen. He screamed in agony as it pierced his abdomen, pulling him into the water. Captain Banks took out a knife and tried to cut one of the tendrils that had wrapped around our deck. It was a futile task, and another quickly wrapped around his leg, instantly snapping the bone within. He screamed as the creature tore at him, digging into the leg and reaching through his abdomen. He was dead before he even hit the water. The ship started to topple over, and I clung to the railing. Then, something rammed us, and the ship fell back into place. The tendrils retreated into the ocean, and we were temporarily free. I looked for any sign of my crewmen, but they'd all been snatched away. Alone, I peeked into the waters, and saw what had been my unlikely hero. It was Eros. He had plunged his massive body into the monster, which had redirected its attention towards him. It dug its tendril into his body, blood filling the waters. He kept swimming, pulling away from the monstrosities, and they followed. In his wake, he left a trail of blood, leading them away from my damaged vessel, giving me an opportunity to escape. I set course in the opposite direction, not hesitating to make use of the escape window granted to me. The creatures didn't follow, but I never stopped fleeing. It took another full day before I finally made contact with the mainland. I alerted them to my situation, and they sent a ship out to meet me. I'd sustained minor injuries. My crew, on the other hand, had all but succumbed to the horrors of the ocean. I don't know what happened to Eros, if he managed to get away or if the things caught up with him. Whatever the case, he saved my life, and I owe him everything. In his search for a family, he had inadvertently awoke something from the deepest parts of the ocean. According to recent hydrophone recordings, there are millions of them across the Pacific, and they're spreading further and further around the world. The seas are no longer safe, and there's nothing we can do to stop them. I might have made it back to shore, but what truly horrifies me is that despite being 1,000 miles away, I still hear them singing. At first they were only sounds, but now I finally understand. They want me to come to them, and I don't know how long I can resist.
In 2 miles, take exit 19 for Valley Park Drive South. Siri chirped from my sister's phone. Charlotte, turn that off. I know where I'm going. You sure about that? I mean, it has been a couple of decades, Mark. Please, like I could ever forget where Adventure Valley is. Come on, we spent every summer of... There it is! I swerved briefly into the oncoming lane as Charlotte thrust her arm in front of my face to point excitedly out the window. There's Adventure Valley! Oh my god, what ride is that? That coaster, it was called Steel something, right? No, wait, that's Mayhem Mountain, isn't it? I gently pushed my sister's arm out of my face and back over to her seat. I couldn't fault her for her excitement, being that it was taking an awful lot of effort to control my own giddiness. It felt like we were kids again, yelling and bouncing in the back seat of my parents' car as the first shining rails and wooden planks of the park's roller coasters came into view above the treetops. That's the Steel Viper, I told her. Mayhem Mountain's on the other end of the park, and that wooden roller coaster over there is the Excalibur. Oh yeah, I remember those. I was always too much of a wuss to ride the Viper, but I rode the crap out of the Excalibur. Well, Charlotte, you're an adult now. I think it's time to take on the Viper. As long as the contractors have tested it and given it the okay, I'm in. That was really the question, wasn't it? We didn't know which rides had been inspected and cleared and which ones hadn't. I sent up a silent prayer that Mayhem Mountain was counted among the rides that had. I'd left Brandon several voicemails asking about it since he was the one in charge of everything. But with how fast things had been moving since we'd bought the park, I couldn't fault him for being a busy man. If you'd told 12-year-old me that my crazy, hyper, wild-eyed friend Brandon Decker would end up graduating cum laude from Northwestern Business School, I would have laughed in your face. Brandon? No way. Tyler, maybe, but never Brandon. In fact, half the reason I think he chose a business designation was because of Adventure Valley. When the park had closed in 1989, Brandon had gathered us all together in his basement, and, with a gravitas and solemnity I've never seen in him before or since, asked us to make the pact. At the time, the promise had been the most serious vow that 5 12-year-olds could ever make. High off an entire summer of Adventure Valley fun, we agreed, with all the ceremony of a meeting of Parliament, that we would one day come together and buy Adventure Valley Amusement Park. Of course, back then, our plan had been to buy it and just ride the roller coasters into the ground. We decided which friends from school we would let in, and which enemies would be barred from the gates. It had always been our park, and it was only right that we should have it. It had taken 20 years, but we eventually did fulfill our promise. With a hell of a lot of pushing from Brandon, and a sizable offer of collateral from Tyler, the bank had agreed to give us a multi-million-dollar loan to buy, repair, refurbish, and reopen the park. The size of the loan for which the 6 of us were now responsible had given me nightmares for several weeks. How would this place ever turn a profit? It had been closed decades ago after operating in the red for several years. The county had experienced a high number of runaways and missing persons in the area in the last years of the 1980s. The entire region had been on edge as the cases mounted and people in the area became depressed and suspicious of each other. It had absolutely killed park attendance. But seeing the first cresting waves of roller coaster rails through the trees made me all but forget about my financial worries. This was Adventure Valley, for God's sake. If we opened the gates, people would come. There! That's our exit! Charlotte squeaked. I pulled off the interstate and took a left under the bridge. Less than a mile later, we came upon the park's acres of parking lots to our right. We turned in and drove all the way up to the front near the gates where several other cars were parked. A Lexus, a Mini Cooper, an old Chevelle, and a Honda Civic, another rental car like ours. Looks like we're the last ones here, Charlotte said. She was right. As we pulled up next to the Lexus, I noticed a group of people standing next to the ticket booth, waving to us excitedly. Oh my god, is that Tyler? Wow, he's lost some weight. He's so skinny now. And Brandon's losing his hair. Whoa, is that Koji? Koji got hot. Calm down, Paris Hilton. These guys are my friends. They're off limits to you, same rules as when we were teenagers. Besides, half of them are married. Really? Which half? I raised an eyebrow at Charlotte and shook my head in amused bewilderment. My little sister never had outgrown her boy craziness. Wait, who's that? Charlotte asked as we got out of the car. What? That's Scott. You know Scott. Not Scott. Scott looks exactly the same. The girl next to Scott. Oh. I'd put this off so long that I'd actually forgotten to tell my sister at all. That's Danny, Scott's girlfriend. Danny? As in Danielle Bircher? Well, yeah. My sister gave me such a horrified look that you'd think I'd betrayed her to the death. But it was fleeting and quickly replaced by a sly smile. Fine by me. I'm sure she's not the same person she was in high school. We're all adults now, right? Now come on, let's go. A sigh of relief escaped my chest as I slammed the car door and followed Charlotte over to the entrance. Though I saw most of these guys every year, seeing us all here together, standing at the ticket booths of Adventure Valley, brought me a sort of happiness I hadn't experienced in many years. Mark Lantis, I can't believe it. Tyler had an edgy, commanding voice that probably made his many employees shudder and scatter, but I knew him like a brother, so his bravado just made me laugh. Can you believe it? I asked as I gave him a hug and a slap on the back. Back at the front gates. $15 a day doesn't seem so ridiculous now. Pfft, $15 a day my ass, Brandon said as he shook my hand. By my math, it looks like we'll be charging about $65 a day. I'll pay it, Charlotte smiled as she gave Koji a hug. Are people really going to pay $65 a day? Koji asked. Even Disneyland only charges $85, and there you get access to 2 parks. How could I forget? Brandon shook his head. One of our investors works for the mouse. Pity they won't let you design any artwork for this place. Come on, man, I'm not an artist. I'm an engineer. Don't you mean Imagineer? Charlotte winked at him. Koji sighed and shook his head. Yeah, I do. As Brandon and Charlotte teased Koji, I made my way over to the side of the ticket booth where Scott and his girlfriend were conversing. I didn't know why Scott was being so standoffish, but I thought it might have something to do with the investment. Scott, the least well-off of the 6 of us, worked at his dad's collision shop and hadn't had a whole lot of money to invest. I thought maybe he was embarrassed about the money, but now, watching him lean against the booth with slowly shifting eyes, I realized it wasn't that at all. Scott was just stoned. Same old Scott. What's up, Burnout, my brother? I haven't seen you in like 15 years. How about a bro hug? Hey, how's it going, man? Look at you. What's your diet, man? Rabbit food and lettuce? You're not gonna get any ladies with that skinny body. Your mom doesn't seem to mind. Hey, Mark. I'm Danny. Do you remember me? Danny Bircher? Scott's girlfriend gave me a shy smile and stuck out her hand so we could engage in a stiff handshake. Yeah, I think so. You were in my sister's class, right? Charlotte Lantis? Danny had the decency to look embarrassed. Yeah, but we weren't really friends. That's putting it lightly, I thought. We were freshmen when you guys were seniors, she added. Yep, I do remember that. Maybe I should just get it over with. I called Charlotte over, and the reintroduction of the 2 girls, while awkward, was over pretty quickly, to everyone's relief. We were all eager to get into the park. It was odd not stopping at the window for tickets, and even odder to walk around the rusting turnstiles of the front gates. I delighted in reminding myself that we owned this place now. Brandon gave us a tour of the park. Not so much of the geography, we all knew that inside and out, but of his vision of the hypothetical layout and reorganization of Adventure Valley. The Excalibur is going to need the most work, according to Rich, our head contractor. A roller coaster made of wood exposed to the elements for all these years. We'll keep as much of the original structure as is safe, but we might have to rebuild most of it. Do we have the money for that? Scott asked loudly from where he walked behind us with Danny. Yeah, Tyler said. We have the money for that. Ah, Mr. Moneybags. That mini dealership treating you well? I nudged him hard with my shoulder. Tyler stumbled but kept enough composure to push me back into a passing churro stall. Those 6 BMW dealerships are treating me very well. Well enough to serve as the sizable collateral we needed, Brandon added. So, Charlotte ran up behind us and threw her arms around Tyler and Koji. Can we ride some rides? Are you kidding? Why do you think we're here? Tyler laughed. I'm just here for Mayhem Mountain, I said, clapping my hands and rubbing them together eagerly. Brandon threw up his hands. All right, fine. I thought you guys would be interested in how your investment is coming along. Koji snorted. All we're interested in is the projected ROI, and more importantly, which rides have passed safety inspection. Oh. Brandon stopped walking and tried to look annoyed, and failing that, he smiled. A little over half of them are rideable. Suddenly, everybody was talking at once. Is Steel Viper on? Yeah, that one's on. What about Snapdragon? That one is good to go too. Renegade Falls? The water's not on. High Roller? Yes. Space Spin? Oh yeah. Power Tower? They're doing the inspection this week. There was only one ride I really cared about. Mine and Brandon's favorite. What about Mayhem Mountain? Hell yes, he answered, to collective groans from the rest. Mayhem Mountain had always been our thing. The others had always been happy to ride High Roller and Snapdragon into exhaustion. Brandon and I always split off toward the end of the day to ride Mayhem Mountain into the twilight hours. Ugh, Charlotte shuddered. I hate that ride. It's boring as hell, Koji agreed. I helped design something similar for Disneyland Hong Kong. It's so tame we put it in Fantasyland. Hey, that ride is awesome. It's long and it goes upside down, I argued. Charlotte is even too scared to ride it. I'm not scared of that ride. It just gives me the creeps. Something about it just seems, I don't know, off. All right, look, we'll start at this end of the park and work our way toward the back. That way we can ride every ride that's passed inspection, including Mayhem Mountain, Brandon said. And Snapdragon, Tyler added, and the others nodded excitedly. Yes, every ride, and of course we can ride them, as many times as we want. Hell yes, brother. Koji high-fived Brandon and we headed down the street towards Space Spin. Our progress through the park was blissfully slow. Everyone wanted to ride every ride multiple times, and one person always had to stay in the loading area to operate the ride. It only took an hour or two to forget that I was a fully grown 35-year-old man. Being back here, running through the lineways with my friends, arguing who got the first row of the first car, it was like being 12 years old again. Still, my eye was constantly drawn up over the buildings into the distance, to the back of the park, where the high, gleaming rails of Mayhem Mountain shone in the unobscured sunlight. There would be no arguing who got front row on that coaster. It was me and Brandon. It was always me and Brandon. Charlotte, Tyler, and Koji were the most like children, constantly running ahead and arguing over which ride to go on next, yelling back to ask Brandon if this one or that one had been cleared by the contractors. Brandon and I hung back from the group a bit, discussing ideas and possible improvements for the park. Scott and Danny brought up the rear of the group, quietly talking and lighting joints. When we arrived at the Enterprise, a simple ride that consisted of spinning cars on a circular track, I offered to flip the switch while the rest of the group rode to excess. The Enterprise always made me sick when we were kids. Brandon offered to stay on the platform with me to chat, while everyone else rode the ride. I flipped the switch to turn the ride on, and as the car spun away from the loading area, the Enterprise's signage came into view. I sighed. All day I'd been trying to ignore the bright graffiti sprayed all over the park, but the words painted over the signage for the Enterprise were impossible to ignore. Where did the missing kids go? And the rest of the graffiti in the park was much the same. Most said things like, "Where are they?" "Runaway Row," "Find Ryan Kinski," and "The missing are now dead." Similar sayings could be found in towns sprayed across a few dilapidated buildings in the industrial district. Brandon's eyes avoided the sign, but I could tell he was thinking about it too. Do you think the reason they shut this park down, do you see that being an issue for park attendants? I asked as casually as I could. Brandon was quiet for a few moments as he waited for the ride to slow to a stop so he could flip the switch again. Nah, I don't think so. Low attendance issues aren't really what shut this park down. They aren't? This surprised me. No. When we were negotiating the sale of the park, I was given access to the park's financials in the 80s. So they weren't operating at a loss? Oh, they were. But this park has operated in the red since opening day in the 70s. Half of their revenue was being fed back into something called county services, whatever that is. The bank couldn't tell me, and believe me, I tried to find out. County services? I mused. Yeah, bizarre. And according to the paperwork, the park was closed because the owner didn't want to live here anymore. And he couldn't be bothered to wait for a decent offer on the property, so he just sold it to the bank for next to nothing. So he was a rich guy. I leaned back against the railing to stretch my back. And an idiot. Yes, to an extreme in both cases. The owner of the park was Abel Bisset. Abel Bisset? Related to that French billionaire, I'm guessing? Brandon nodded. Michael Bisset. He built this park for his son in the 70s. Abel was never really what we would call business inclined. I've always heard him described as simple. I can't believe the son of a billionaire lives in this area. Well, not anymore. He moved on decades ago. I shook my head in disbelief. Who would have ever thought that our simple little park was owned by a famous billionaire's son? Hell, I might have even sat next to him on rides and never had any idea. You guys want to go again? Brandon yelled to the others as the ride came to a stop. I'm ready to move on, Koji yelled back. Anybody want to ride again? Nope, a chorus of voices replied. It was near 5 o'clock when we finally arrived at Mayhem Mountain. As the sun began to set, a familiar panic and urgency welled in the pit of my stomach. It took a moment for me to realize that we didn't have to leave when the park closed this time. Because the park didn't close. We could stay until sunup if we wanted to. As I eagerly approached the turnstile for Mayhem Mountain, Tyler spoke up behind me. Listen, can we run into town and grab something to eat before we ride Mayhem? You really want to ride Mayhem after we eat? Asked Koji. Good point. There's only one loop. Danny rolled her eyes. 2, I said. Don't forget the inline roll. Yep, 2, Scott answered. Plus, it's a 2-minute ride. If your food isn't sitting well, you've got a long wait till it's over. Look, I said, let's ride it a couple of times and then go eat. When we come back, we'll see how we feel. Everyone nodded, and we started walking through the lineways up to the platform. When we reached the loading dock, I was excited to see our favorite green car sitting on the track. Front seat! Brandon and I yelled simultaneously as the train cars came into view and everyone behind us groaned. I'm staying here, Charlotte said. I'll just work the launch pad thingy. Still scared after all these years, Char? Scott teased her. Shut up, burnout. Scott laughed and tousled her hair before running up and jumping in the first car behind Brandon and I. Danny got in next to him, and then Tyler and Koji took the second car. We pulled the shoulder restraints down, and they locked in place. Ready? Charlotte asked. Yeah, Brandon yelled back. Send the car through! Charlotte pulled the lever, and the brakes disengaged. As the car moved forward, I turned to Brandon. Did we get the green car on purpose? I yelled to him as the coaster clacked around the load platform and began the clattery climb up the first lift hill. Yeah, we sent cars through here all morning, but I made sure Rich knew to leave the green machine in the loading bay. Awesome! As the train climbed up the lift hill, I made no attempt to hide my utter glee. I looked out over the expansive park and couldn't believe it was mine. Every track, every car, every turnstile, every screw. From the front gate to the overflow parking lot in the back, it was all ours. How I wished I could go back in time and tell young me waiting in the 2-hour line for Mayhem Mountain, one day you will own this place. And as we crested the hill and the train fell into the first drop, I realized I essentially had gone back in time. At the very least, I was screaming like a 12-year-old, as was everyone else behind me. We dipped into the first tester hill and then banked up hard to the second lift hill. We dropped from there down into the vertical loop, banked around a set of gift shops, up briefly, and then down a small hill into the inline roll. When we arrived back at the loading bay, we were all screaming and whooping. Charlotte didn't even have to ask, just smiled at us and sent us through again. We went twice more before we finally got off the ride. Koji walked over to check out the control panel while the rest of us taunted my sister. "Are you sure you don't want to go, Char? It's awesome." "Nah, I'm good. I have no problem being the carny for this ride," she laughed. "Come on, Charlotte, just one time. One time and we'll leave you alone," Tyler urged. No way. Not interested. All right, anything else, though? "Hey, do you guys know what Track B is?" Koji asked. "Track B? What do you mean?" Brandon walked over to Koji at the control board and raised an eyebrow. "That's weird." "It's probably just the track they use to get the cars into the storage bay," Scott said with a shrug. "No," Koji said. "That's called a transfer track. Track B has to be something else." "Yeah, well, I've been on this ride enough times to know that there is no other track." "Yep," Tyler agreed. "He has." "So, should we try it?" Brandon tested. No," says Charlotte. "If you don't know what Track B is, that means the contractors don't know about it either, which means it hasn't been inspected in at least 20 years. That's suicide." "Look," Koji said, "if Track B exists, then even the most incompetent of engineers would have found it during an inspection." "And Rich cleared this entire ride," Brandon nodded. "It's probably just the ride in reverse. We're good." "Well, we're in," announced Scott from the other side of the track, though Danny didn't look quite on board with the idea. "Mark?" Tyler asked. "Yeah, I guess I'm in. What's the worst that could happen? We get funneled into a repair bay?" "All right, then I'm in too," Tyler said hesitantly. Koji shrugged. "Here goes nothing." He flipped the switch over to Track B, and a moment later a loud metallic scraping sound some distance away filled the park. The sound lasted almost a minute. I studied the familiar silver roller coaster under the pink sky of the setting sun, but I saw no physical changes to the track. I looked over at Brandon and a shrug of his shoulders told me he didn't either. "Shall we?" Scott asked, gesturing to the train cars from which we just disembarked. I gave Charlotte a questioning look, but she emphatically shook her head no. So it was just the 6 of us again. "It's only right you two take the bow of the ship." Tyler gave a mock salute. "Oh, captains, my captains." I laughed and hopped into the right side of the front row. Brandon crawled into the seat next to me. Tyler and Koji got in behind us, and Scott and Danny took the back. We pulled the shoulder bars down, and they locked into place. "Are you sure about this?" Charlotte asked when everyone was settled. Danny said something from her place a few rows back, but all I heard was Brandon yelling, "Bullet!" The brakes released and the train rolled away from the platform and into the twilight of dusk. The lights had lit up on the track while we'd been arguing, and the roller coaster looked absolutely beautiful. I was filled with awe and reverence at what this place truly meant to me and my friends. It was a symbol of our youth and innocence and blissful ignorance of the problems and conflicts of the adult world. It was our own little bubble of happiness. The coaster again climbed the lift hill, and from the top, Brandon and I studied the track, but in those few seconds I saw no difference. Brandon looked over and I shook my head at him disappointedly. By the time we reached the vertical loop halfway through the ride, it was clear that there was no Track B. But it was still hard to be upset because I was still on Mayhem Mountain and still found it an impossible challenge not to smile. We banked around the now brightly lit gift shops, up the small tester hill, and then back down the inline roll. Except The inline roll was suddenly above us. We'd missed it. Instead, the track now descended into a large square hole in the ground behind the gift shops, and we were headed directly into it. I was in too much shock to scream or even move. The black hole swallowed us in an instant, and we descended into complete darkness. I felt a comfortable pressure leave my shoulders and realized that the shoulder bars had released. I gripped the front lip of the edge of my seat and heard the terrified screams of my friends behind me as the coaster suddenly spun into what felt like an inline roll. I was too scared to do anything but hold on for dear life, though some part of my brain registered that the G-forces of the roll probably would have been enough to keep me in my seat, even if I had let go. Probably. We came out of the inline roll and dropped again hard. As the roller coaster dropped, the room suddenly lit up around us, and I saw the track below arcing up into a light tester hill. As we hit the bottom of the hill, the shoulder bars lowered mechanically. The car went over the small tester hill and then braked to start up another tall lift hill. I took my first breath since dropping through the ground and looked around, tuning out the screams of Danny and Tyler behind me. We were in what can best be described as a cavernous room, which I could only assume from its vastness stretched to the farthest reaches of the park above. There were lots of vertical loops, high drops, and sharp curves that put the track perpendicular to the ground. Throughout the entire sub-level building, lamps dotted the wall every 30 feet. They put out a dreary yellowed glow for as far as the eye could see, but many were burnt out, and in some places, the track disappeared into darkness. In the dull, yellow edges of the light, I saw something that registered in me a horror beyond death. Far away from us, in a section of shadowy track, I saw the high crest of a peak hill which reached almost to the ceiling of the giant room. And then the track just ended. Suddenly I felt the horrible reality of the world outside my mind begin to bleed in. Danny was screaming uncontrollably, Tyler was crying, bawling even, and Koji was yelling at Brandon, who was looking straight at me, hitting my leg hard and repeating my name. As the cars continued to climb, I finally gave him my attention. I didn't want to be alone in the fear anymore. "What is this?" was all I could think of to say. "We have to get off this ride! We have to get off this ride, Mark!" "I know, man! We're going to die!" "I know, man!" I yelled as we reached the top of the lift hill and dropped over the other side. I squeezed my eyes shut until I felt the shoulder bars once again release, and I bit my lip to keep from crying. I opened my eyes and choked as I watched the track ahead of us bend up into a vertical loop. I reached up and tried to pull the shoulder bar down, but it was locked in place. "Hang on! Hang on to the seats!" I yelled as loud as I could. As we approached the loop, I felt the brakes engaging, slowing the car, and I felt a tow cable catch beneath my feet. We were being pulled up through the loop, but too slowly for gravity to keep us in our seats. As the train began to invert, I felt my feet rise from the floor of the car. My hair fell over my face and my butt left the seat. I closed my eyes and tried to block out the screams of terror from behind me. I concentrated on my death grip of the ledge of my seat as we rounded the track. We remained upside down for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the pressure began to ease, my butt dropped back into my seat, and my feet felt the floor. The white noise in my ears subsided, and I was suddenly aware of Koji screaming. "Tyler! Oh my god, he fell out! Oh my god, he fell! He's dead, man! He's dead! He hit the track down there!" Brandon yelled at me, wide-eyed and looking half-crazed. I was finally seeing the Brandon from my youth. The shoulder bars descended again, this time locking in tighter. We came out of the loop and sped up and down several tester hills. I tried to study the track ahead of us as we went through the safer parts. I thought I saw water reflecting off the metal rails somewhere in the distance. Brandon sobbed in his seat. "Mark, what are we gonna do? I don't want to die, man. I don't want to die. I don't know. I don't know what to do. I'm sorry, I'm scared too," I answered him. We banked around a corner of the room and the shoulder bars released again. This time, we dove into a curve that put the left side of the train parallel to the ground, and it was a long drop. I gripped the edge of the seat tightly as before, but this time I kept my eyes open and was able to catch Brandon as he began to slip out of his seat. By the time the train righted itself, I couldn't tell who'd been lost. Most of the screaming behind me had turned into loud sobbing or silence. The shoulder bar didn't re-engage, and I felt the car's brakes slow the train down again. I didn't have to look to know what was coming next. It was another inverted loop. This one was tall and large, and I could tell we'd be upside down for longer. Someone behind me began screaming again. Danny, I think, as I tried to take measured breaths and position my hurting hands back under the lip of the seat. Brandon did the same and looked over at me as the car started up the loop with tears streaming down his face. "I don't want to die in here, man." I shook my head back at him because I could think of nothing to say. I felt tears leave my own eyes as we reached the tipping point of the loop and my feet again left the floor. Before we were even completely upside down, I felt my back begin to slip down the seat. I thought, if I lost my grip, I could try to grab for the shoulder bars when I fell out of the car. The car suddenly stopped, and I opened my eyes to see we were completely inverted. I grunted loudly at the pain and immense effort it was taking to keep my grip on the seat. The car started to move again slowly, and I heard Brandon say something to me. I looked over at him, just before he slid out of the car. 1 second he was there beside me, and the next, he was falling away from the car. I saw Brandon try to grab the shoulder bar on the way out, but he couldn't keep his grip on it. I watched him fall, and I saw him break his back on the track below, and he stopped moving. I stared down at him as the car continued to move slowly around the loop, and he stared back up at me, dead or dying. By the time the car hit him on the way out of the loop, he was completely gone. The shoulder bars re-engaged, and we went through a dreadfully long period where nothing happened. We were secured in our seats by the restraints as the coaster spent what felt like several minutes racing over hills, banks, curves, even an inline roll. Without the adrenaline pumping through my veins, I felt the shock begin to wear off. It was replaced by a panic and fear unlike I'd ever experienced, and I decided that was the point of this section of track, to build and facilitate an unbearable fear. At long last, I felt the brakes engage, and I looked ahead to find the loop we were surely entering. But there was none. We were high, almost to the top of the ceiling, and we slowed to a stop on a straightaway. Directly ahead was a drop, and at the bottom of the hill, a series of 4 different tracks, with a transfer stack just before they split off. Each track had 5 or so feet of color, red, orange, green, and blue, before racing off in different directions. I felt an urgent shaking of my shoulder and turned around to hear what Koji was saying. "Which track are we connected to?" I looked at the transfer stack. Green. "Where does green go?" It was hard to hear him over the sound of Danny's sobbing from the second car. I tried to trace the green track through the building, constantly losing it and finding it again. I wasn't sure, but it seemed to end at the lift hill I'd seen earlier. The hill with no track at the top. "It ends at that hill!" I yelled back at him and pointed. Danny cried louder. "Oh no." While we were stopped, I rubbed my hurting hands together. As I looked down at them, I noticed something new in the car. At some point, a small, blinking panel had flipped over in the wall at the front of the car. It had 4 colored buttons and an old analog timer. The timer was so old and damaged that though the numbers were clearly changing, I couldn't see how long we had. "We get to choose," I said, and explained what I was looking at. "Can you see which track ends where?" Koji asked. I followed each of the tracks as best I could, but the rails circled and slid in between each other. It was hard to tell which track went where. "I think the blue track ends in that big pool in the corner. The red track ends in a wall, and the orange one just drops into a hole in the floor like the one we came down here through, I think." "There's no way out, dude," said Scott from the second car. His voice was unsettlingly calm. "They're just telling us how we're gonna die." "We can still find a way out of this," I answered quietly, speaking more to myself than to him. "Choose the pool," Scott said, and I could hear the tears in his voice. "I've heard drowning isn't an awful death. I've heard it's calming at the end." "No, choose the hole in the floor," said Koji. "It's possible it drops down into another cavern like this. There might be more track, which means more time to figure out how to live." "You don't think we'd be the first to choose that option, do you?" Scott asked him. "And no one that went missing ever came back. There's just more death in that hole." "I don't want to die like this," Koji begged. "And at least it's a chance." Danny was still whimpering in the back and offered no suggestion. It seemed the decision was up to me, and I had to make it fast. I knew I didn't want to die by dropping off the track. I didn't want to drown. Perhaps the quickest death was the wall. More than likely, we would all be killed instantly. Less suffering. Less time to think about our fates. But the truth was, I wasn't entirely positive which track ended where. It was all educated guesswork, and my time was up. "The orange! Let's go down to the second floor, if there is one." Scott and Danny said nothing, and Koji choked out the last words I'd ever hear him say. "Push it, before it chooses for us." Before I could think about it any longer, I pushed the orange button and committed us to whatever death it promised. We heard the metallic scraping of the track transferring below. Once the orange track was securely connected, the brakes on the car released and the train rolled slowly toward the drop. Danny started screaming again. As we dropped down the hill, I got a better view of the orange track. There was a vertical loop ahead that didn't look as high as the others we'd been through. In fact, it looked like there was a chance the fall wouldn't kill us. If it wasn't an optical illusion, and if the shoulder bars disengaged for that loop, we might have a shot at living through this. I yelled back to everyone behind me. "Let yourself fall out of the loop! The one up there!" No one responded to me, which didn't matter because I didn't think I'd have the courage to let go of the seat anyway. We raced along the track, in and out of banks and curves, and at one point we passed along the pool and I looked down. Below the water's surface, the track ended above an even deeper pool. I could see the shadows of several coaster cars at the very bottom. I suddenly felt the brakes engage, and I realized we were coming to the loop. I tested the shoulder bar by pushing up on it, but it stayed locked. I was momentarily relieved to think I wouldn't have to make the decision to fall out now or gamble on the orange track. But suddenly, the restraints released. As we started up the loop, I gripped the lip of the seat tightly and turned my head back to look down. It looked like we were very high, and I only hoped the ground was the loosely packed dirt that it looked like. I had to choose right then, the fall or the hole. I chose the fall. As I began to slide up the seat, I yelled at the others to let go and fall out of the car, and then I closed my eyes and let go. I felt my head crack the shoulder bar on the way out. It wasn't like a slow motion fall. It was over before I realized that I'd actually let go. One moment, I felt an intense pain as my head hit the bar, and in the same moment, I realized I was on the ground. I hadn't even had the time to realize the possibility of hitting the track below or getting run over by the cars. I opened my eyes in time to watch the cars speed over the track above me. The pain didn't hit me all at once. I had one long, blissful second before I felt it. And then I was in agony. I'd hoped my body would be so in shock that I wouldn't feel much of the pain, but I felt it all. I concentrated on keeping my eyes open and trying to catalog the damage. There was blood on my clothes, but I didn't know from what part of my body it was coming. I heard screaming as well, but I didn't know if it was in my own head or coming from my friends as they approached the gruesome end. I didn't want to move, didn't think it was safe to move, but I knew I had to, if only to pull out my phone. With trembling fingers, I pulled the thing from my pocket and brought it to my face, trying to focus on the screen, but it was shattered and refused to even turn on. I threw it away from me, and suddenly, I became aware of the oppressive silence. Their ride had ended. With Herculean effort, I rolled over onto my stomach and dragged my broken body across the ground to where I thought I remembered seeing the hole. I crawled for what seemed like hours, and maybe it was. Sometimes I tried to stand or even kneel, but the pain in my back and ribs was too great. I passed out several times from shock and pain, but eventually I made it to where the track disappeared into the ground. I pulled myself to the edge and looked down inside the hole. The track ended just below the surface. It was a natural shaft with walls made of rock. I don't know how deep it went, and I didn't want to. It was a fate I'd only narrowly escaped. But then I thought of my friends down there, and ever so fleetingly wondered if maybe someone had survived. "Koji?" My voice echoed loudly down the shaft. No answer. "Scott!" Nothing. I reached for a nearby screw and dropped it down the hole. It took far too long to land, and when it did, it was with a tink as it hit something metallic. The small sound echoed up the shaft and out into the cavernous room, and I realized this place was built with acoustics in mind. I rolled onto my back and studied everything I could see from where I was, staving off my body's desire to pass out again. I felt nothing but numbness when I finally saw what I was looking for. A long, panoramic window in the far wall. I knew then what Track B was for, and I finally let myself slip away into the darkness. I remember very little of my rescue. There were lots of people in uniform and my sister yelling and pain. Lots of pain. I was in and out on the way to the hospital, but I remember I passed through the room behind the window at some point, and from my stretcher, through the chaos, I saw in that room a single chair facing the window. It was covered in a deep layer of dust. I was never visited by anyone official, let alone asked to give a statement. Charlotte stayed by my bedside at the hospital for months while I recovered. She wouldn't say much about that day, although she finally did tell me something. She said that they wouldn't let her ride with me to the hospital, and that someone had offered her a lift. On that drive, she'd been confronted by two people that had convinced her to never speak of what had happened, and had instructed her to convince me of the same. Whatever they threatened her with had her begging me to agree. And I did. At the time. I am still, to this day, relearning to walk without aid. I never saw Mayhem Mountain again. The loan defaulted, and Adventure Alley was bought up by an unknown LLC, which bulldozed it to the ground and built a block of apartments over the top. They're still empty to this day. I don't like the dark anymore. It reminds me of the horror my friends must have experienced as they looked down and saw the track end just before they disappeared into that hole. I try not to think of what they must have felt as they plummeted down the shaft in complete darkness, strapped to a roller coaster, awaiting the terrible end. I wish I'd chosen the pool, if only to save them from that fate. As for the billionaire's son, he was only simple in the fact that he was a man of simple tastes. And he still is. I looked him up once, only a few years ago. He owns several amusement parks now, all sizable, but small enough to be popular only in their specific regions. In fact, one is not very far from where I live now. But then I realized that I probably didn't need to search all the rides in the park to confirm what I already know. Somewhere in that park, some ride, in some corner, has a track B.
Death by electrocution or hanging? Ethan asks Garrett, killing time as we wait in line for the newest ride at the amusement park. Boys, seriously. We are in the happiest place on Earth. Can't you find something better to discuss? I glance over at my husband Zach, but he shrugs his shoulders as he grins, and I can read his thoughts. Boys will be boys. I'm outnumbered again. Not that I mind. Not really. But Mom, the line is so long, and we are so bored. I stretch my neck from side to side in sympathy. I'm constantly busy with work, the kids, and day-to-day life that one would think a few minutes with nothing to do would be welcome. However, there is something about moving inches at intervals that makes creeping time unpleasant. I understand, but please don't hurt my heart by imagining ways to die. Are you tearing up? Ethan leers over me. He's 18 and taller than me by almost a foot, and he loves to lord it over me every chance he gets. I catch a whiff of his Ralph Lauren body spray and a faint hint of perspiration. I brush the tear out of my eye. No, it's sweat. Oh, Mom, you're okay. Nothing's going to happen. Are you worried about the ride? Not to be outdone, Garrett flops a long, lanky arm over my shoulders. He, too, is inches taller than me, but a few years younger than his brother, and still willing to nestle in close. The Old Spice deodorant wafts over me, and I take in a deep breath of his scent, relaxing into him. It's fine. It's the incessant heat and the repetitive music and the crowds. Let's take a break after this one. We're almost there. I can see them loading the cars up ahead, my husband Zach contributes. Thank God, I mutter. I check my Fitbit for the time. The digital readout shows me a little after 3:30 in the afternoon, and I mentally give myself a high five. With over 25,000 steps, no matter how many churros I eat, I should still be able to tug on my jeans when vacation ends. I definitely prefer the rides where we can skip to the front of the line. Agreed, Zach says. The boys focus their attention to the front of the line while continuing their conversation. Global warming or alien invasion? Garrett asks Ethan. Zach rubs my back, but I step away, embarrassed my shirt is sticking to my back. Everything okay? I sigh. Yeah. Damn hormones. I feel fucking out of control. Those boys are going to be the death of me. I take a deep breath and let it out slowly as we move forward a few paces in line. We needed some time as a family to reconnect. I'd lost my mom around the holidays, and with Ethan leaving in the fall for college, I wanted to stuff the boys back into my womb to keep them safe and near me. Hanging on to time with the kids felt like trying to wrangle water. It either slipped away or dried out before I could get a grip on it. The roller coaster takes off like a rocket and immediately pisses me off. The G-force pulls my cheeks into a rictus of terror, while a flash of light captures my horror of a purchase in the gift shop after the ride. I hate to be scared, and I loathe myself for not researching the ride before I got on it. The harness pins me to the seat of the coaster and awkwardly holds me in its molded plastic embrace through twists, drops, and turns in the dark cavernous space. Neon freeway signs guide our passage as the track weaves through the faux pitch of night. Cold air caresses my skin, but the wind is as manufactured as the manicured lawns and airsets lakes of this fantasy land. Finally, we round the last corner into the flat straightaway. The snake of cars comes to an abrupt stop in the middle of the final stretch of the track. I can barely turn to make eye contact with my husband because my head is braced to the seat, but can see my kids in the seat in front of us smiling and laughing. Concrete walls surround us as rock music blares out of the speakers. I need to pee. A sign up ahead signals the conclusion. I'm relieved to know the end is in sight. Zach and I are the last two passengers, the caboose of this adventure train. We come to a complete halt. The kids only have enough movement to turn their heads to the side to shout back to us. "What did you think?" Garrett yells. Ethan chimes in, "Totally cool, yeah." "Awesome. Best ride ever," I shout back. I can see Garrett smile because he's sitting in front of Zach. "So you hated it, right, Mom?" "What gave it away?" I grin. I can't wait to escape off this thing. "Did you like it?" I ask Zach. "Sure, it was fun, but I'm ready to go back to the hotel and chill," Zach responds. Truer words, babe. The pressure in my bladder is growing urgent, and I push against the restraint which hardly budges. "What's going on? Doesn't it seem weird to be stuck here? Shouldn't we be moving or something?" I ask Zach. Zach shakes his head unconcerned. "I'm sure they're just unloading the group ahead of us." He reaches out and pats my hand. "Are you sure we aren't stuck?" I pushed against the padded metal contraption, testing my wiggle room. It doesn't shift a centimeter. This thing is safely constructed in the 21st century, and I am well and truly trapped in my seat. I want off this ride. Zach's harness appears a little looser, like maybe he didn't pull it down across his chest as tightly as I had. "Can you shift that thing?" I ask. He presses and the unit clunks, allowing for slight movement. "Nope, I'm pretty secure here." "But it seems like you have more space in comparison to mine." "That's because of my wide shoulders." He flashes me a wink and flexes his bicep. I wish for his levity as I twist again, trying not to let my fear of confined spaces weave its tendrils in me. In front of us, Garrett turns his head and shouts back to us. "I think the coaster broke down. Dad, check over the side. Do you see a walkway?" I study my surroundings. We are in a tunnel. The track is raised a bit from the floor, but there is a sidewalk off to the right side of the car where we could depart. The entirety of our chain is stuck in the middle of the space. A neon arch signals the tantalizingly close exit just around the bend, toward what I can only hope is the disembarking area. The area is no frills, all concrete blocks and low lighting meant to be whizzed by in a blink. Ethan asks, "Do you think we'll be evacuated like we did from Highland Falls?" The excitement in his voice palpable. I strain to listen to them because they are a couple of feet away from us. Even though we are sharing the same car, the harness makes it hard for them to move their heads enough for their voices to reach us. The short guitar-laden riff keeps replaying, an indication we shouldn't be sitting for this long. A recorded voice pops over the music. "The ride is experiencing technical difficulties. Please stay off the track. The ride may resume without warning." I stifle a giggle and shove against my restraint. And how exactly would we be able to hop out to stretch our legs on the track? "Maybe it's a warning to the workers," Zach asks. Ethan shouts, "Cool! Do you think we'll journey behind the scenes again?" I don't know. Now that we are stuck, my bladder clenches, and I wish desperately I had used the bathroom beforehand. I consider what will happen if I pee on the seat. It's molded plastic, so I'm fairly certain I would end up sitting in a puddle. Luckily for Zach, we each have our own precast space, so my shame would be my own. I imagine my humiliation as we roll into the unloading dock, and the groans of the workers as they witness my soaked ass leaving the ride, all resulting in a loudspeaker telling the guests the coaster is temporarily closed for hazardous cleaning. Boos and jeers follow me as I depart, my kids, horrified, walk as far ahead of me as possible so as not to be associated with me in any way. To distract myself, I ask, do you think a group is stuck in the middle? Like, what if they're stuck upside down? Surely someone else must have it worse. The G-force or gravity would settle the cars to a flat spot, my husband calmly answers. Do you think there's a safety mechanism? A catch release to open our seats, or do you think it needs a command? There's probably a catch hidden, but it would be extremely difficult to find. Too many idiots would be exploiting the system. My heart rate picks up, and the walls appear to shift closer. The air coming into my lungs feels heavier, as if my lung capacity has shrunk, and the air can't inflate my chest. Zach reaches across the seat and takes my hand. The loudspeaker comes back on with the same recorded message about a problem with the track. The time is 4:36 p.m., and we are still stuck. No workers come to rescue us. The cart hasn't moved, and the recorded message hasn't changed. We've diligently searched for any release buttons, but if there is one to push, we haven't found it. My bladder is pulsing with my heartbeat, and my thighs and knees are shoved together so forcefully that if it wasn't for the pain, I'd wonder from the sweat buildup if I'd already succumbed to the pressure. There are 6 cars in our little train, each loaded with 4 passengers. We can't tell much about the people ahead of us, as the coaster spans 35 feet, and no one can turn their heads more than slightly to the sides due to the head restraints. The music is so loud we can scarcely understand the kids in the seats in front of us, let alone the car in front of them. I can count the hairs on the boys' heads, yet I can't reach out to stroke them. Zach maneuvered his phone out of the holder in front of him, but has no cell service. Ethan tried to grab his phone from the front pocket, and proceeded to drop it on the floor. He shuffled with his feet to try to snag it, but so far with 0 success. Garrett, having watched Ethan and given us the humorous play-by-play, carefully retrieved his phone and was currently playing a game, which kept them both occupied for now. Zach, what is going on? I ask for the 100th time. I don't know. This can't be good. My breath hiccups as I try to keep from crying. I know. What could possibly be keeping them from coming to rescue us? The lawsuits alone should have them rushing to release us. Why hasn't a real person made an announcement? Zach stares at me with bleak eyes and holds my hand tighter. I wish I hadn't pulled away from him in line. I'm scared, I whisper. I've since peed the seat, and my butt is already starting to dry out. The boys also had to go, but at least they had the option to aim for their feet. Pain is starting to shoot down the sides of my neck from being locked in the same place for so long. Garrett's battery died, and now they keep asking more questions that we can't answer. We've played several rounds of I've Never and Would You Rather. The game stopped when Ethan asked, would you rather die slowly of starvation and be dead, or die fast but live on eating others for the rest of your life? What the fuck, Ethan? Dude, not cool. I don't want to admit how much his question unsettled me. At 6:43, it's after sundown and still nothing has happened. Let's take a break. I'm struggling to hear anyway. What? I'm joking. Right, but I love you and don't like to think about those things, okay? The boys turn forward and I trade a look with Zach and we both shake our heads. My skull is pounding and an internal pressure is building like I'm going to burst out of my skin. I'm not sure I'll be able to enter into an enclosed space after this experience ever again. I'm craving the touch of my family. I want Zach's arms around me. I want Ethan stepping on my toes and Garrett's arms hanging around my shoulders. I start to hyperventilate and push those thoughts away. We'll be out soon enough, I tell myself. Over the music, a woman screams to be heard. Hello? Can someone call 911? I think my husband is having a heart attack. A murmur goes up as the canned announcement breaks in and one man yells out, Lady, I've tried my cell phone 1,000 times. I can't receive any service in here. The system is down. Another woman shouts out, I'm sorry, we've had the same experience. The first woman's lilting voice makes me wonder if she's of Southern descent. Does anyone know what I should do? I can't reach him. Her voice breaks into a sob. Tears of commiseration rise in my eyes as I peek at Zach and wonder what I would do. My son gazes back at me and I shake my head miserably. We've been stuck for hours. We have a bag of kettle corn and half a bottle of water. My kids, screwing around, spilled what soda they had left arguing about whose it was, And so they have nothing. My daughter is going to try to dislocate her arm to get out of the seat, a man yells out to the group. Will that work? I ask my husband. It can't hurt, he answers. Ma'am, tell your husband to hold on. Amina is twisting herself right now. She's super flexible and she's willing to try to knock her arm out of the socket if it means getting us help. Yes, please, hurry. Her voice is hysterical and keeps breaking as she tries to be louder than the guitar riff. He's having trouble breathing. A few minutes later, a little slip of a girl is standing outside of the tracks on the walkway. Everyone starts applauding. Sweat is trickling down the sides of her face, her arm is hanging perversely, and yet she holds her head proudly as she walks down the line of cars to the front. A mischievous grin comes across her face and she gives a quick bow, holding her one working arm out like a performer. As she walks down the track, I can see her bottom is wet from sitting in a puddle. We cheer her and she limps off, holding her arm gingerly as she rounds the corner and exits out of sight to find help. Excited whispers and chatting reanimates the group. I think my feet are numb. I try to wiggle my toes, but it's just something to say. I feel reinvigorated. Finally, something will happen and we can clear off this damn ride. Zach grasps my hand and squeezes. Not for long. I can't wait to go home and take a shower. Mom, do you have any water? We are dying up here, Garrett yells back at us. Well, if you guys hadn't been fooling around, I respond. Please, it was Ethan's fault. Help is coming. Dad can reach, right, Dad? The hopeful expression in his eyes about breaks my heart. Whatever is keeping people from liberating us can't be good. While I try not to think about it, it's all I can do to keep my mind from ping-ponging on possibilities. Why hasn't anyone come looking for us? In a place dedicated to providing outstanding experiences, this situation is more than a little abnormal. And in a world where lawsuits are a dime a dozen, well... I glance at Zach. What do you think? You guys can wait a few more minutes. Teach you a lesson, he says. I narrow my eyes at Zach and he doesn't look at me. I keep obsessively looking at the time. The guitar riff lasts 3 minutes, 43 seconds, the announcement 25 seconds, and in between there is a blessed 5 seconds of bliss. It's been 1 hour since Amina left. Zach is pelting the boys with the kettle corn, challenging them to catch it with their mouths, which serves to occupy and distract their starving bellies. The announcement ends, and in the window of silence I make out a pop, 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 which sounds like distant gunfire. I pull a muscle in my neck, jerking my head to Zach. Did you hear that? He shakes his head. What? The music starts up again. Keep throwing popcorn, I hiss. Zach frowns at me and complies. I reach over and seize his hand in a death grip. I think I heard gunfire. His eyes widen. The message ends, and we both hunch forward, straining our ears. Zach watches me as he concentrates, and then I catch a rhythmic rat-tat before the guitar screams out over the speakers. We both sag back into our seats. Garrett's turned to face us, and his eyeballs scan back between the two of us. What's going on? He asks. Zach throws a kernel and nails him smack on the nose. Garrett grabs the corn and pops it into his mouth, allowing himself to be distracted. It must be pretty bad for her not to return, Ethan states. There is no point wondering, Zach says, trying to shut down speculation. All it does is stop the kids from talking to us as they whisper back and forth with each other. Did you hear anything? I ask. I don't think so. Well, keep listening. I think the second time I might have heard an automatic weapon. That can't be right? Not here. I think you are getting yourself worked up. Just breathe, Zach says. I will once I get out of this seat. He mimics taking a deep breath and blowing it out. I yank my hand away from his and face forward. A loud wail interrupts my thoughts of throttling Zach. I think the woman's husband died, I whisper, as if I'm afraid she will overhear us. Where is the girl? I ask as I reach back to clutch his hand. What could be keeping her? What is happening out there? Do you think this is it? Are we going to die here? I hope not. Is there anything we can be doing? Well, that's why I didn't give the boys the water. Yeah, I figured as much, I say grimly. I occupy myself with going over every square millimeter of space I occupy, but it's useless. There aren't any screws or knobs for me to try to manipulate. Someone screams, "Oh my God!" "What is happening?" a voice sounds above the music. A wave of panicked voices surge over the zippy beat. Someone whistles sharply. A man's voice calls out, "There is no easy way to say this, but the woman's husband who died of a heart attack appears to have come back to life and is trying to eat her." I turned to Zach and started to cry. The kids peer back at us with panic in their eyes. I struggle against my restraints. I look at Zach. Is there any way I can do what that kid did? Can I dislocate myself to twist out of this thing? Zach's frantically shoving against the restraint. None of us are flexible, so bending our way out of the situation is out of the question. I catch heads bobbing as the people in front of us gyrate with what I assume is the same ferocity as us. Straitjackets would be as damning. "Mom, I'm scared," Garrett yells. "Me too, buddy. But hold on. Try to wiggle out. Do whatever you can to maneuver out of your seat. Break your arm if you need to. We have to get out. Our lives depend on it." I start hitting my shoulder against the plastic molding. With my shoulders firmly secured, I can't get a good enough angle or enough momentum to twist enough to make a difference. I scream in frustration. Ethan squints at Zach because he can't quite turn enough to make eye contact with me. I force a laugh. "I'm just trying to hulk it. I thought a little extra inner power might help." He nods, not believing me, but wanting to. When I pictured all the dangers my kids would face, I imagined things outside of my control. Strangers, someone luring my kid with candy, or following a ball out into the street. As they got older, it switched to online fears, which morphed into concerns about alcohol or heroin or antibiotic-resistant chlamydia. But I didn't think I would end up watching them die in front of me while I could do nothing but witness. This was the most fucked up hell I could imagine. We joked about a zombie apocalypse. Jesus, what had Ethan said? Eating others for the rest of your life. Surely this had to be some sort of reality TV joke, and someone was going to bust out any moment and... "Mom, I don't want to die like this," Garrett shouts, tears streaming down his face. "I know. We will figure out a way." "Mom, I don't want to be a zombie," he cries, hands pushing against the bars holding tight against his shoulders. I flash to him on a baby swing, face screwed up, arms outstretched, hollering for me to rescue him. Ethan starts jumping up in his seat. "Garrett, shut up." I remember one day when I got mad at Ethan for something stupid when he was 2 and yelled at him. Instead of crying, he laughed at me as if my overreaction was the funniest thing in the world. "We'll figure this out. Right, Zach? We got this." Zach is silent as he studies the front of the cars, and I'm so angry with him for not fixing this. Why can't he fix this? Why can't I? "Zach!" I scream. "We can't let this happen to them. We've got to do something." Zach looks at me with tears in his eyes and smiles. His hand is holding mine, and he blows me a kiss. And I breathe. A loud whistle rips over the music. Startled, I glance up. A small figure limps into view. Behind her is an undead cavalry. Amina's head dangles and swings. Her hair hangs in her face, so I can't make out her features. I strain my eyes to understand what I am seeing. At first, my eyes think she is moving funny because of her dislocated arm, but I catch the shine of white bone and understand the arm is no longer attached. Behind her follow 6 tourists. Because of the dimness, it would be easy to think this is the rescue we've been waiting for. But deep down I recognize they are not our salvation. My chest vibrates with a hum rising and resounding through my clenched teeth. They don't appear dead. More like plastic dolls puffed up like marshmallows. Their skin is tight and shiny, as if stretching to contain their fluids. Blood should be gushing out of the missing bits and pieces, but instead the raw flesh is startling bright like the red scales of a koi fish. One rather large woman has had her breasts ripped off and her belly removed, but her double chin is intact. Her empty ribcage gleams in the twilight with an inner pearlescence. "Mom!" I hear. I grip Zach's hand, and my bones pulverize from his pressure. I close my eyes. Shut your eyes, guys. I love you. Shut your eyes. Buzzing vibrations itch in tight threads. The rippling crimson waves distort my vision. Hunger roars and recedes, and like the ocean, it will never be satiated. I lift my head and push away. No more is to be had. My hand tangles and I tug, eager to move on. When my hand frees, it loosens an object that falls into my lap. Light is sucked into its depths. Oily metal fills my nose, and the hunger urges me to move on. I pause. Cold sinks into my thighs, and I try to understand the object. Gun. This is a gun. I hold the word in my mouth as I grasp it with my hand. I try to stand and fall over. I try to stand and fall over. I slide on the ground. A part of me scrapes against the pavement. A piece of white chalk on a black chalkboard flashes in my mind and is gone. Meaning is as ephemeral as the memories of who or what I am. I rise to my knees, and am able to place one foot down and then the other. I'm not right. The emptiness in me howls and eats my thoughts. Everything but the hunger. I breathe the air, searching for something to fill the clamoring void. A scent on the breeze that is not food calls insistently. I peer down at my hand and observe I am clutching the black object. My hand loosens to let go. My mouth remembers the word, gun, but keeps it safe, tight within my lips. I increase my grip. I trip and get back up. I trip and get back up. A gust of wind blows against my face and the aroma is stronger. I know this scent and it guides me into a dark carnivorous space. My ears hurt with the loud sound and I almost leave. The hunger cannot detect food, but the scent is stronger here and its claws are sharper than the hunger. The world is washed in cerise ribbons. The odor is in front of me, but I don't understand what I see. I pause and try to remember, but hunger needles me with every cell, leaving no room for anything else. I move forward to take one last inhalation of the smell that is better than hunger. I trip and my arm falls against one of the objects no longer food. Soft hair brushes against my bare skin. "Mom, I don't want to be a zombie," I remember screaming in my head. The word safely held releases from my mouth. Gun. I raise my hand and point and pull. The hunger chatters against the ringing in my ears. There is another, and I reach out to touch before I point the gun again. The harsh noise distracts the hunger. In that moment, I am satiated. The oily metal does not call like food, yet it feeds. I move it to my mouth and put it in. The cold burns my lips, and I pull.
I didn't plan on staying at a motel that night. My apartment is normally a perfectly nice, pleasant, and comfortable place to stay. Unfortunately, the notice on the door of the building said we had to make other arrangements for the next 2 days. Why, the note didn't say, but I heard a neighbor had overheard the super talking about termites or something. It was especially upsetting because with everything else going on out in the world, travel wasn't exactly the greatest thing to be doing right now. Chances were he was even lying about it, that he just wanted the building to himself so he didn't catch anything. But choosing between having to shore up somewhere and having bug spray in my nose and on my toothpaste, I'd take my chances with the unknown. I don't have family close by, and all of my friends were huddled together with their families and didn't have the space for me anyway, so I started driving around. Most hotels were dark, save for a few cars in the parking lot, and had signs up saying they had no public rooms available. The Ophidian Motel was the only place I could go that was open, and by the look of it, not too many people were interested in taking them up on the offer. I couldn't blame them. The place probably hadn't been properly sanitized in months. It was one of those single-level places that try to look quaint on the outside, but you know nothing quaint happens behind those closed doors. Still and all, it was the only game in town for me, and with it being a few blocks from the interstate and my apartment, it was convenient enough that if things went bad, I could go back to my super's apartment and sleep in front of his door if I needed to. Hell, even if he made up the bug spraying just to get everyone away from him until this all blew over, maybe this would make him change his mind. I went in to see the front desk clerk. Bored, young, looking at his phone and sighing. I went up and handed over my card. 2 nights, please. He looked up at me, and then at his phone. You know, you should probably be home. This stuff affects the older population way worse than the rest of us. Dick, I'm not that old. And even if I was, he didn't need to be talking that way. Not the time. 2 nights, please. He handed me a bunch of paperwork, and while I filled it out, I nearly jumped as the big green phone at the desk rang. I looked at the clerk, who ignored it. I wondered if he even knew what it was. Aren't you going to answer that? He shook his head. This time of night, it's always robocalls or prostitutes. One tries to take my money and the other one I can't afford. Cute. I finished my paperwork and waited until he swiped my card and gave me a room key. An actual key, not one of those key card things everybody uses. He sprayed it with disinfectant and handed it over. He held up the bottle. Want me to spray you, too? I looked at him, and then at the bottle, which was a bleach-based Lysol knockoff. No, but I recommend you keep spraying yourself if you need to. Don't need to catch anything from an old fart like me. I left, watching him shrug, then spray down the counter where I was. I didn't expect much from the room, but then I don't think many people ever do. Still, it was more pleasant than I expected, with a microwave, mini bar, widescreen TV, though one of those cheapy ones that sell for $50 at your local retail store with no name brand on it, a round table and chair, and a queen-sized bed. I was surprised it didn't have a quarter-operated magic fingers machine attached to the bed, though some bolt holes in the frame and headboard suggested it might have had one, years ago. There were only 2 doors in the room besides the entry door. The one to the bathroom, big enough to fit half a person comfortably, and the door to the adjoining room, next to the head of the bed. Not even space for a closet. I tossed what clothes I had brought onto the chair, turned on the TV, and settled in on the bed. After a few minutes, I remembered there was a vending machine outside and figured I'd grab a snack and a drink. When I left the room, I could hear the TV set almost as clear as day, even as far as 10 feet away from the room. Paper-thin walls. Figured. I was at least glad there didn't seem to be anyone else here, not only so I wasn't bothering anybody, but hopefully I wouldn't be hearing anyone, well, enjoying the company of each other would be a nice way of putting it. I went to the vending machine, situated on the wall next to the office, and was about to put in my dollar when I heard the desk phone ring again. Jeez, even in the office the walls were thin. But I heard the clerk pick up. Funny, I thought he said it was all robocalls this time of night. I held off putting in my dollar for a moment. If I could hear him, chances are he could hear me, and I kind of wanted to hear what kind of call he was getting. Might be worth a chuckle, if anything. Hello? Yeah, sorry, couldn't answer earlier. Taking a reservation. No, wait, I know, but trust me, you'll be fine. Look, you know me. I wouldn't let it bother you. It's just one guy. It'll be fine. Okay, see you in a bit. The phone clicked. I began to wonder who that was on the other end of the line, but then it clicked. He said robocalls and prostitutes. Even if they weren't for him, he probably had some kind of side arrangement with people who did. Who knows, maybe I'd catch sight of a local celebrity. TV anchor, city council. My super. Anybody was possible. Guess I would be hearing loud, obnoxious noises through the wall tonight after all. Even if they took a room all the way at the other end of the motel, I'd probably still hear it. I waited a minute or two before I bought my stuff, acting like I hadn't been standing outside listening the whole time, then went back to my room, climbed into bed, left the TV running, and called it a night. Even with the infomercials playing, I was still woken up by the sound of a car door slamming and footsteps. Now, I expected to hear 2, maybe 3 pairs, but the scuffling I heard outside was a lot more than that. It had to have been a group of 6, 7 people easy, but definitely not the sounds of a John and his lady going off to spend the night. I also heard more than that. It was muffled, but I could hear someone sobbing, moaning, like they had a gag in their mouth. I almost rushed to the window to look out when I heard voices in the parking lot. It was the front desk clerk and another. A deeper voice, but hoarse, like he had done a lot of coughing or yelling lately.
The room is ready.
Just like always, man. I'm telling you, there's no better time than tonight.
And just the one guest.
Haven't seen anyone else, and it's just been his car in the parking lot.
Then take care of it in the usual way. And keep it quiet. And this is yours.
I heard something change hands, and as one set of feet shuffled away, the other stayed in place, and I could hear something flicking, like someone digging through a roll of money. This was not some typical sex-related side business going on. I was wondering what I had gotten myself into when I heard keys jingling, and my doorknob started to unlock. I pretended to be asleep. It may not have been the best thing for me to do, but it was all I could think of. I think part of me was just scared of what was happening, and the other part wanted to see what was going on. With one eye squinted, I watched in the hazy light of the TV as the door opened, and the clerk came in. He kept an eye on the bed while moving to the table, where he took my keys and put them in his pocket. If it had stopped at stealing my car, probably with the intent to chop shop it, I could have lived with that. Just gone on my merry way and ignored the weirdness going on here. But after he pulled out the switchblade and popped it open, I knew no matter what, I wasn't going to be killed over it. Not without a fight. I snored slightly and shifted a little. Those made him hesitate and take a step back. I took the opportunity to flop my arm over the bed. He waited a minute or so longer and then moved closer, holding the knife low. It looked like he planned to hold my mouth and plunge the knife in underhand, stabbing me as much as possible before I could react. Had I actually been asleep, he may very well have succeeded. He'd done this before, I could tell. He came in close, ready to cover my mouth. He leaned up against the bed. With my free arm, I grabbed the back of his jeans, finding his hamstring, and squeezed. He was so surprised that he yelped for a moment, loosening his grip on the knife, and he tried to drop to one knee. Letting go of his leg, I grabbed his head and slammed it into the headboard as hard as I could. He fell to the floor. I went into his pocket and got my keys, took the knife from the floor, and left him there. I didn't know if he was dead, and I didn't care. I had thankfully slept in my clothes, so all I had to do was grab my bag of stuff and get out. I went to the car and was about to hop in when I looked over at the other rooms in the Ophidian. I saw one that had lights on in it. Not lamplight, but a flickering, low light, like a room full of candles. There was a low sound, like chanting. Several voices all speaking at once, and in the midst of it, the terrified sobbing I had heard earlier, sounding like it was getting more desperate. I looked out at the street. Even at this late an hour, cars would be bustling by. But now, nothing. Everyone was terrified as it was. I doubt the police would even be able to come in time. I really wish I knew what came over me. I'm no hero, but maybe I was just a little pissed off at almost being murdered while I slept, and I didn't want it happening to anyone else. I went over to the room, and with all the strength I had, I kicked the door. The chain on the inside had been pulled to prevent entry, but the hinges were so old and rotted that it didn't matter. The door flew open the opposite way, leaving the door hanging from the security chain alone. Inside were a group of figures, all in black robes. One stood and moved toward me, and in the middle of the circle, I saw a young girl, maybe 12 or 13. Bound, gagged, nearly naked, and absolutely terrified. The one who came toward me placed his hand over my mouth and, with very little effort, pushed me up against the wall. The hand holding me was gray, wrinkled, almost mummified, but strong enough that I could feel my jaw ready to crack against the pressure. If he had squeezed any harder, it would have broken for certain.
This isn't for you. You have seen too much.
It was the same deep, hoarse voice that had spoken outside my window. The hood of the robe fell back, and what was underneath was worse than I imagined. A gray, wrinkled head, shriveled, bald. If it had once been a person, it was barely one now. I tried to pull his hand away from my face, but as strong as he was, I could barely manage anything. I could now see, in his other hand, he held a strange, intricate dagger. It had a blade that zigzagged like a snake, and on the handle was a bottle screwed into it, like the bottom of an airbrush gun. In the blade itself, there were grooves, as if it was designed to collect blood or something in the bottom of it. As I fought, he seemed to be slowly lowering the blade to a spot near my stomach. He turned to the others.
Not as fresh as hers. But will anyone here mind an appetizer before the main chorus.
The others laughed. They all had similar, raspy, coughing voices. As he looked away, I tried to dig into my pocket for the switchblade I still had there. I felt it and pulled it out, keeping it hidden as best I could. He turned back and pressed the blade into my stomach. Not far, just the tip of it. While it was painful, the smile he gave me was what panicked me the most and forced me to act. I clicked the switchblade and sliced at his wrist. I expected blood. I expected a grunt of pain. I expected just about anything except what actually happened. His wrist severed completely from his arm and fell to the floor. He looked down at it with his yellow, rheumy eyes, more surprised than anything. But where you'd expect to see bone, blood, anything at all, there was just a void. Underneath the gray, wrinkly skin was an empty shell. Or maybe not quite empty. For a moment, I thought I saw something. Greenish-gray, thick, oily, writhing. Like it was going to push its way out of the arm like a tube of toothpaste. The mummified man quickly gripped his wrist hole closed and reached down for his hand, as if he meant to keep something from emerging. I saw my chance. With my jaw aching and the puncture wound on my stomach stinging, I ran forward and grabbed the young girl off the floor. The others reached for me, but I slashed out with the knife, and I saw a finger fall here, a hand there, and the one so injured also grabbed their arms, fighting to control something that wanted out. The escape itself was a blur. I barely remember anything beyond that until we were both in the car, the keys turned, and peeling out of the parking lot. Nobody followed us. I didn't know why, and frankly, I didn't care. I found a brightly lit street corner, right off the interstate, where I could finally see a few lazy cars drifting by. I tried my best to calm her down, and between my hands and the switchblade, was able to remove her gag and her bonds. I talked to her, asked her name, where she was from, where she wanted me to take her. She gave me everything she could. She had been kidnapped almost a month ago. She had no idea what was going on in the outside world. She'd been locked in a room, by herself, after somebody had grabbed her while waiting at the bus stop for school, with only occasional bits of food shoved into her cell. Then, today, somebody in a robe, she wasn't sure if it was one of the ones in the room or not, gagged her, bound her, and put a bag over her head and threw her into a car. I wouldn't have believed she didn't go without a fight, but after a month of little food and the strength of the man who attacked me, I didn't doubt one person could have done it. I asked her if she knew anything about the people who had taken her. "All I know is they wanted me scared. Fear makes it stronger," they said. But she didn't know what that "it" was. They never said any more. She assumed they didn't need to. After we gave our statements to the police, they were able to call her family, and she was reunited. They questioned me for a while, and I told them everything, except the fact that the kidnappers were some kind of hideous alien freaks. That I knew they would never believe. They asked if I saw a vehicle to run a license plate. I told them I hadn't bothered because I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Don't want to believe my story? That's fine. I don't blame you. Anybody can make up anything online. But I can tell you this. I've learned a few things since that night. First, I found out what it was. Adrenochrome. It's a substance everybody has in them, made by the adrenal glands. It's out there if you want to buy it, but rumors say that there are certain people that get off on the high it produces, that it can extend life, and the only way to produce the best is to induce fear. And the best fear comes from younger people. Well, based on what I saw that night, maybe something tempted people, powerful people, to sample this stuff, and now they can't get on without it. They need to keep their existence a secret, to go on with their horrible, extended lives, snatching health and joy from the lives of people, especially children. Is it any wonder why there's a market out there for the slave trade? I've since moved out of my apartment, and I've sold my car. Front desk clerk has my credit card info, and probably my license plate. If I killed him or not that night, chances are someone has my information, and I need to hide it. But I haven't even gotten to the best part. See, I did see a local celebrity that night. I've been to his website. He's running for re-election, local city council, just as I guessed. And he just put out a video. Looks like a perfectly healthy 37-year-old. Thing is, his dad was a city council member too. I've seen pictures. Funny how both of them look exactly the same. They've been doing this for a long, long time. I saved one, but how many haven't been? How many have been drained by that awful knife? But I still think the most horrible thing is what tried to escape from that wrist that night. Something saw an opening and was trying to force its way into this world. Something so monstrous, even they tried to keep it held within. Something held back, protected by only a paper-thin surface.
The world's fattest man awoke in a dark corner of a rattling train car, smelling straw, rust, and rot. An elongated box was against the opposite wall, draped in a tarpaulin, lit by flickers of passing light from the cracks around the door. There was one like it in each of the boxcars, shrouded from the sunlight. Dr. Madness, the ringmaster, never put all his eggs in one basket. He was far too wily a bastard for that. The world's fattest man shifted, feeling sweat pool among his many rolls. He had no way of knowing which one of Madness's helpers was in the coffin, but the fact that it was in there with him at all made his skin crawl. He stretched as much as he could, feeling the press of humidity in the boxcar. He wondered what new mark they were steaming toward this time. Madness never let him go in the advance party, arriving a day ahead of the circus to spread flyers and drum up interest. Madness sent younger boys, and Cyrene, the snake dancer. Cyrene always drew them in. He imagined her parading down the street in her spangly outfit, one of her boas asleep on her shoulders. The world's fattest man was too cumbersome, too inconvenient to ever go on ahead. He had to be hauled in and out of the boxcar with a series of platforms and pulleys, like a wounded elephant. "Crawl, elephant boy," the others teased. "Show us your little trunk." He shook his head. It hadn't always been like this. Madness made him into a freak. The world's fattest man had a name once, Alfred Nocher. Back in 1910, before he joined the Seven Symphonies Circus, he'd been 16 and husky. His life at the time had seemed limited. Go to college and try to find a career, or follow in his father's footsteps and learn household carpentry. Neither option had appealed to him, and he thought he'd be happier if he could just cut ties to his former life altogether. The Seven Symphonies Circus had come through the neighboring town of Drayville, and he'd gotten it in his head that he was meant for a life on the road. He'd read Leaves of Grass 3 times and thought that maybe he could travel the world, writing poetry and sipping from Lady Luck's cup. After the show, he'd approached the circus owner, Dr. Thaddeus Madness, with his hat in hand, sweat on his still hairless lip. As Alfred walked up to the ringmaster, Madness's face had changed, his broad lips breaking into a grin that showed every tooth. That close, Alfred had been able to see the cracks and streaks in Madness's makeup, the ravages of sweat and time. "My boy," Madness said, clapping his shoulder. "Enjoyed the show, did you?" Yes, sir," Alfred muttered. Good, good. Be sure to tell your friends." He paused then, and had seemed to look Alfred over. Alfred hadn't met his eyes but for half a second at a time. "Oh my," the ringmaster had said. "I know that face. Yes, I do. Don't have many friends, do you?" Alfred had shaken his head. "No, sir." "Well, we can't have everything, can we, son?" Madness had leaned back and glared at him. "What can I do for you?" Alfred had crumpled his hat in his hands, unable to release it. Well, sir, I was hoping I could hire on with you for a spell. I know sums and cooking, and I can do hard labor." Madness had given him a skeptical look. "I know I don't look it, but I'm as hard a worker as you'll ever find." "How old are you, boy?" 18, sir." Madness had grinned at that, and Alfred worried if it had been because his voice had quavered at the lie. The ringmaster looked around the big top, and his smile had faded as he watched his worker's progress. "I can always use a hard worker," he grumbled. That was back before Madness had acquired his helpers, when setting up and striking the circus fell to human hands. Alfred glanced across the boxcar to the covered coffin once more. He didn't know where the helpers had come from, but being so close made him sick. He shuddered. It was probably his imagination, but he could smell its contents baking in the stifling heat. Madness had not asked any more questions that first night, which was a little disappointing because Alfred had prepared a whole story about how he was an orphan and no one would miss him. Instead, Madness had clapped him on the back and told him to report to Greenlee, a tall man in a slouchy gray hat. Madness had declared that night a trial run and said that if Alfred did a good job, they would discuss permanent employment. That had been the best night of Alfred's life. He'd sweated, broke brand new calluses on his palms, and had felt all the while like he had made it into the ranks of illustrious and magical people. He was happy. When the Seven Symphonies Circus left town 3 days later, Alfred went with them. Madness fed him well and provided him with a bunk. He'd assigned Alfred to help Greenlee with whatever was needed, but Alfred had caught Madness watching him sometimes, looking at him like a butcher would a hog. After learning what he could from Greenlee, he had been reassigned to study under Magno, the strongman. Alfred had eaten the same things as Magno: a dozen raw eggs, steak, rolls, mashed potatoes, several helpings of everything. Magno had lifted weights and exercised all day, but Alfred didn't. Alfred had just gotten fat. When he'd brought that up to Madness, the ringmaster had eyed him and nodded. "You do seem to have gained some weight," Madness had said. "Maybe strongman understudy isn't the best fit for you." A few days later, Madness had approached Alfred. "One of the freaks is sick," he had said. "Can you fill in for a few hours?" Alfred had been appalled, but he agreed. In hindsight, he'd wished he'd asked which freak. Madness and Greenlee had taken off Alfred's shirt and pants, then puffed gray powder on his skin and hooked a long, fake nose onto his face.
"Your backstory is the Elephant Boy," Madness told him. "Abandoned as a child, you were raised in the wilds of Africa by a herd of elephants. Don't speak, don't get up off your hands and knees. You can trumpet if you want. Let me hear your trumpet."
Alfred had tried his best, but Madness winced. "No trumpeting, just tromp around in circles and eat some peanuts." "What peanuts?" "The ones folks'll throw," Greenlee had said. Alfred had looked pleadingly to Madness. "Sir?" Madness had waved a hand dismissing any further talk. "Pretend you're an elephant. Make it fun." They dragged him to the Elephant Boy's booth. "But no hands. Elephants don't have hands." Alfred dropped to his knees, wondering what his mother would say if she saw him there, crawling through the straw like an animal. Staring at the coffin, Alfred thought of his mother. He hadn't seen or heard from her since he signed up and didn't even know if she was still alive. The past 10 years had dragged on, and Alfred was tired. Tired of eating, tired of the stares, the mocking crowd, the disgusted noises women made under their breaths as they passed his stall. Alfred didn't speak much anymore, and people rarely spoke to him, rendering his tongue out of practice. After he reached a certain size, people stopped seeing him as anything other than a breathing collection of rolls and bulges. They seemed to forget he had ears, and as a result, he'd learned so much over the last decade. He was fed up with the secrets, the lies, and the deaths. Alfred made up his mind. He began rocking back and forth, trying to tip himself over. He succeeded, with a sound like a giant pancake being flipped onto a hot griddle. The coffin sat only 4 feet away. He started to crawl. After his first night as the Elephant Boy, Madness had raised his pay. He'd sworn that Alfred was the best he'd ever seen, but if he wanted to be truly great, he would need to put on more mass. Alfred occasionally wondered if his life would have turned out differently had he just said no. But he didn't say no, and Madness had assigned him weekly weight quotas to reach. He was restricted from any unnecessary movement. At first, it had been relaxing, like a paid vacation, but crawling around on his knees carrying all that weight had soon become painful. His knees grew swollen and red until Madness had stopped dusting him with gray powder and finally canceled the Elephant Boy. Soon after, Greenlee had given Alfred a chair. "Don't stop eating," Madness had said. "You'll be our biggest attraction." And just like that, Alfred became the great monstrosity, the world's fattest man. Alfred struggled forward, his flabby stomach dragging along the dirty, straw-covered bottom of the boxcar. He was coated in a sheen of sweat. His chest hurt, but he continued crawling forward an inch at a time, dragging himself by his huge, heavy arms, his legs trailing behind, just extra ballast. For a while, Alfred had been able to get around on a pair of heavy crutches. Madness scolded him, claiming he was doing harm and that he should let his legs rest. Alfred did not listen. He had enjoyed whatever slivers of freedom he could find. At one town stop, Madness had brought a physician in to perform a yearly physical exam of all the talent and crew. The doctor's breath reeked of gin. He had started with Alfred's reflexes and then weighed him. Alfred must have fallen asleep because the next thing he remembered was waking up to find the doctor gone. The backs of his ankles ached, but he'd grown too fat to see or reach them. Madness told him the doctor's orders were to stay off his feet for at least a month, otherwise it might result in permanent damage. He wouldn't say exactly what the doctor had done. Alfred's weight had swelled in the following weeks. His ankles itched and ached, driving him mad because he couldn't scratch them. When the time had finally come for Alfred to walk again, he'd fallen over immediately upon standing. He had called for help and madness came. The ringmaster had shaken his head sadly. "You shouldn't have pushed yourself," he said. "Now look what you've done." Alfred had dreamed that if he just rested his legs long enough, they'd recover, and he'd be able to walk away from the Seven Symphonies circus. But deep down, he had known the truth. Madness would never let him leave. Madness had crippled him. Alfred inched closer and closer. His hand landed on the tarpaulin and pulled it away, revealing a coffin of dark, polished wood, carved and inscribed in a language he couldn't read. Once he was next to it, Alfred definitely smelled the corruption of the thing inside. It hadn't been his imagination. He slapped a flabby wing of an arm over the casket's lid and began the laborious crawl toward the boxcar door. Madness's helpers were one of the circus's many ugly secrets. Alfred knew how they went out into town whenever the circus stopped and preyed upon those who didn't come to see the show. Madness told them not to harm patrons, but the rest were fair game. He believed it was a small price for a circus ticket, a small price to save their lives. The casket was heavier than he'd expected, and Alfred's progress slowed down even more as he oozed across the boxcar floor. The way his heart fought in his chest, and as hard as it was to breathe, he didn't think he had much longer left. For a while, Madness used to bring him hired girls as a reward for a year's work well done. If sitting in a chair and stuffing his face while strangers sneered could have been considered work. He hadn't brought Alfred a girl in 3 years, not since he'd accidentally smothered one. He'd wondered if her family ever learned the truth of what had happened to her, or if one day the girl's mother had woken up with a hole in her life. Most likely, no one had learned of her demise. Madness's helpers probably saw to that. There was a popular snack booth by Cyrene's tent, and he could always smell it from his chair, the aroma of roasting meat and spices forever teasing his nose. The booth's painted sign had read, "Exotic morsels from the mysterious East," and he had often seen patrons wander by with skewers of spiced browned meat. Camel, the signs had claimed, but Alfred had never seen a live camel near the circus, let alone a cleaned and butchered one. When patrons had asked how the meat could be so fresh, they had been told it was owed to a secret preservation technique known only in the Orient and taught only to a dozen chefs a decade. Alfred had seen the helpers come stalking back through the fairgrounds after a kill flushed with life. He had known not to get close or to ask any questions. They had paid him no mind, but he'd overheard them speak of the Angel. The Angel's shows had all been in the Big Top, where Alfred hadn't been allowed, but he'd seen patrons exit with tears on their cheeks, smiling and laughing, as if they were drunk. Alfred wished he could see the Angel perform. He'd have liked that almost as much as being able to walk again. Alfred reached the door and collapsed, his sweaty face pressed to the boxcar's filthy floor, his breath wheezing. He lay there for nearly 15 minutes, trying to regain his strength. His heart pounded against his ribcage so hard that he thought it might burst. At last, he pulled himself up and flipped the latch on the door. Once the top opened, he collapsed like a cresting wave of fat. Despite everything, Alfred had understood his place at the circus. He hadn't been so hopelessly naive. Madness had explained people flocked to his shows for 2 reasons, and 2 reasons only. The light. They come to see something amazing, something awe-worthy, something they'd never be able to do, something that filled them with wonder and hope and made them feel alive. That was Cyrene's job. That was the Angel's dominion. And there was the dark, the ugly, the disgusting, the place where the misfortunate provided something hideous for the patrons to gawk at. The patrons wanted to feel superior. They wanted their little lives to look better by comparison to the disfigured, deformed, and wrong. Alfred had provided that service faithfully and without complaint for years. But no longer. Resting on his enormous stomach, Alfred pried the boxcar door open an inch. The wind whistled, blowing cool air on his face. He smiled. His suffering was not for nothing. He pried the door open a little more, then gripped the edge and pulled the creaking wood fully open, taking comfort in the knowledge that his soul would persist, unlike Madness's poor, damned helpers. The wind roared and sucked at him. The dry fields passed in a yellow blur. Alfred slapped one huge arm on the casket, once more, making a sound like a slaughtered animal dropping to the floor. Something moved inside the coffin, then frantically scratched and pounded against the lid. Alfred took a deep, labored breath, then shoved the coffin out. It disappeared into the air, whipping out of sight. Alfred heard the crack of wood exploding into splinters on impact, and a horrible, inhuman screeching as Madness's helper was suddenly forced into the strong summer sunshine. Madness would hear it. Madness would know. Alfred dragged himself to the edge of the door. The train brakes squealed. He gripped the floor edge, then heaved himself out. He tumbled onto the weedy ground, feeling the gravel bite into his flesh, chewing him apart. He rolled down the embankment, the world going blurry. He'd done it. He was finally free. Alfred came to rest in the little culvert, where dirty water trickled around his swollen feet and patches of wild mustard and black-eyed Susans bloomed. Pain burned throughout his body. Wide gashes seeped blood through the pockets of erupted fat. His ankles and knees had taken the worst, and he did not possess the strength to move another inch. The train brakes ceased squealing at last. Alfred closed his eyes and sighed. The breeze was nice. The air was warm but not hot, not suffocating like it had been in the boxcar. He heard shouting, swearing, the trample of feet. Madness was coming. Madness would kill him for what he had done. But for right then, Alfred was happy. He may not have walked away, but he'd managed to quit 7 Symphonies Circus after all.
How did you hear about this place? My voice broke the long-established silence, a silence that had been building since we snuck out of our houses. It was almost like Marty thought his mother would still be able to hear him despite the hour of walking we had put between us. You know, those internet rabbit hole type sites. He replied in a quick tone that almost sounded like he was trying to hush me. I had initially been excited when he brought up the proposition of some festival deep in the nearby woods. I found this invite online. Don't worry, I checked it out. It's legit. Those words continued to rattle in my brain. The woods weren't particularly dense, and it was easy enough to find your way back to our little town. Just listen for the water, find it, and follow it upstream. I had, however, never been so deep in the woods, and never that late at night. The moon punctured the tree canopies, lighting our way with a scarcity of natural spotlights. How are you holding up? I questioned Marty, not wanting the silence to settle back, as I had no idea how long we still had to go. The night atmosphere and isolation of the forest were, admittedly, starting to give me the creeps. I'm alright. His whispered response only audible thanks to the still forest. He knew what I was referring to. I could see it when he reached up and gripped his sleeve-covered arm. We should be getting close now. Thank God, I thought. I was getting tired of branches whipped across my face, and the foliage was starting to make my thighs sticky. His words rang truer than either of us could have imagined, as after only a few minutes, we saw the silhouette peeking through the clearing in the trees. Well, shit. I spoke more to myself than anyone. With each step bringing the place further into view, I was filled with more and more disbelief, despite it being right in front of me. Marty's footsteps started to pick up, and I could hear his walk becoming a jubilant jaunt across the trees, and before I had a chance to reconsider, we were there. Standing in a large circular clearing in the forest was the imposing shape of Carnival Vivacity. The miniature city before us was completely shrouded in shadow, the light beaming through holes in the clouds being the only reprisal. Did we miss it? I addressed the carnival that lacked any signs of life. Let's just check it out. We're already here. Marty spoke, taking small and timid steps towards the towering tents in front of us. Okay, but I'm not too keen on getting eaten by lions, I remarked. I heard Marty mimic the sound of a lion growling up ahead. I didn't want to say it out loud, but my nerves were standing on the edge. Something about a darkened carnival refused to sit right with me. It wasn't a secret that Marty was nervous too. Despite it being pretty high in the 90s, he was visibly shaking under his long-sleeve shirt. I wanted to tell him to wear something more appropriate. He told me he didn't really own short-sleeve shirts anymore. We got onto the grounds without meeting any resistance. The carnival was like a long-abandoned ghost town as we walked through it. Empty food stalls sat unmanned, and the 3 large tents around us were devoid of the chaos you'd expect from them. This is cool, man, but maybe we should come back another time? No way! Marty spat out, almost irritated at the thought. This is my last chance, Andrew, he more calmly stated while looking around like he was trying to find someone. Last chance for what? My question was quickly halted in my mouth as the Carnival Vivacity sprang to life without warning around us. Like a switch had been flipped, we were suddenly surrounded by a cacophony of colored lights resembling a Christmas tree. Powerful beams of orange illumination reached out from the openings of the tents. We didn't pay it any mind then. We were too focused on the surprise light show. But just like the lights, conversations suddenly started as well. There were people around us when the lights turned on. I was almost unable to really comprehend their sudden appearance. It felt like my brain accepted it as normal. Hello, Miyazaki, Marty said aloud with drawn-out syllables, as he looked around the newly lit-up carnival ground with complete awe. His smile was so wide, I thought he would fit right in with some of the clowns I witnessed trotting around in my peripherals. So, what do we do first? I asked, surprised that the first thing out of my mouth wasn't, let's leave right now. Marty lifted his hand and rested it gently on his stomach as he feverishly eyed a nearby food stand with steam from a grill pouring out of it. I'm feeling pretty hungry, I said. Even though it was so outwardly expressed, Marty was never going to say he was hungry. I can't imagine what he got for dinner that night, if anything at all. He knew, though, that I knew, and he turned to me with a smile and made his way to the stand. I walked behind him, mildly vexed when I saw that no one was manning the stand. And, in fact, no one else was there at all. Sitting on the small round stools in front of the stand, I peered over, looking for someone who could help serve us. When I didn't see anyone, I began to turn to Marty to bring up how odd it was, when a worker appeared out of the corner of my eye. Surprised, I went to look at the man approaching us, but when I did, he vanished into thin air, leaving only a vacancy. Marty started to speak beside me, but I only registered what he had said after I had already come to the same conclusion. I could see a crowd of people walking around the carnival, but they were only there when in my peripherals. If I turned to look at them, they'd be gone. You can only see them directly if you're one of them. Those were the words that slowly registered. One of them? I thought about that sentence, all the way up until it was closing time. I'd like whatever you recommend, Marty spoke to the spectral worker. If I looked straight ahead, it was just a steaming pile of meat. but through the sides of my vision, a cook was working around the stove, flipping the meat and seasoning it. One for my friend, too. I took the time to look around the carnival with a more observant eye. Everywhere I turned, the tightly packed crowd would vanish when meeting my direct eye line. We were alone and completely surrounded at the same time. All but for one. I saw him only for a moment initially. A long flowing red duster that blended in with the surrounding tent. A tall, black hat rested on his head, and just as I caught sight of him, he ducked under a flap of the tent, but not before flashing me a quick glance. There was something immediately off-putting in his glance. Slightly shaken, I started turning back to Marty when the clink of a porcelain plate meeting the bar in front of me roused my interest. A steaming plate of meat and vegetables on top of a flour tortilla filled my nostrils with a heavenly smell. Marty was already wolfing down his food like he had been hunting it all night. The food made my mouth salivate and forcibly pushed any thoughts of suspicion or anxiety from my mind. The food was exquisite. I had never, and likely will never, taste something as good as what the carnival offered us. When I thought about asking for more, I was pleasantly surprised to find that I felt full, despite eating fairly little. Marty, too, let out a huff that told me he was stuffed. Once the food was gone, though, I was once again unsettled. Okay, this is super cool, I admit, but maybe we should go. It's not normal. I had tried to keep it together for Marty's sake. I hadn't seen him this happy in a long time, and the smile on his face was something I almost forgot he could do. It's only for tonight. It's harmless, he retorted. Once it's gone, like the people, you won't be able to see it. He turned his head around the grounds before his sight landed on the tent. Besides, we have to at least check out the show, right? He was beaming. The light cascading from the tent perfectly framed his content, and I surrendered to it. With a quick nod of approval, we rose from our seats. I had turned back and said a quick thank you to the cook. A wispy, "You're welcome," crept into my head. Not like it was said by anyone. It just felt like a thought I would have. We made our way to the tent. My steps were cautious, as I kept thinking I was going to run into someone. Marty's were full of anticipation. He was sneaking up on the tent, ready to see its contents. When we parted the flaps and walked inside, I saw the man in the red coat, standing in the middle of a dirt ring. Out of the corner of my eyes, I saw an audience seated and ready for the show to start. I could feel that they were waiting on us. "This is incredible," Marty whispered, as we slowly made our way to the only 2 open seats we could find, and claimed them as our own. "Welcome to Carnival Vivacity!" The ringleader's voice boomed throughout the tent. His words were said instead of heard in my mind. Even though I could see him when I looked directly at him, his face was difficult to look at for any extended period of time. His features would shift constantly, creating this blurring effect. He was warping between a culmination of every face I had ever committed to memory. As he spoke, welcoming the crowd and describing the night's events, I watched the familiar features of my parents, kids from school, and even Marty's sunken eyes appear on his face. Then, the ringleader rose his hand, and I could feel the metal seat I was in trembling. The whole tent, in fact, was shaking. I turned my head, hoping to catch whatever was causing it in my peripheral, and then I saw it clearly. It was unbelievable. I had seen them in textbooks before when we would study our ancestors, but there it was. A massive, woolly mammoth had waltzed into the middle of the ring. could see both the creature and Marty's infatuation with the whole ordeal in one scene. A few more things played out. A group of people in acrobatic attire walked out and began swinging off ropes hanging from the high ceiling. There was a gasp from the crowd that flooded my thoughts when one of the performers dropped to the dirt. I could see her body fold on impact and become twisted and mangled, bones poking out from her knee. Then, the girl lifted her hand and gave a thumbs up, accompanied by a wicked smile. Everyone laughed, everyone but me. I watched in horror as the girl manipulated her body and put it back together. I hadn't gotten to take it all in, but the girl sparked a notion in me that everyone around us looked so conventionally attractive. Each one sculpted from perfection, belonging to the front of a magazine. Marty, no doubt, noticed it too. I would catch him touching the bags under his eyes or running his hands through his scraggly hair. After watching a tiger jump through the rings of green fire, a fire that would cast light on the tiger, revealing its true decaying self, I decided I had had enough. And now, I just need a volunteer, the ringleader asserted, nearly gluing me to my seat. I knew it was going to happen. Before I had time to try to stop it, Marty's bony arm slipped right through my grasp. His lanky body was already standing up and shuffling through the crowd. I could hear him offering apologies to the people he passed by on his way to the stage. They all just cheered in my head, creating an obnoxious buzzing noise. It all happened so fucking fast. Before I had a chance to protest or to try to storm the stage. Hell, who am I kidding? I wouldn't even have the nerve to try to do something like that. As Marty stepped into the ring, and the leader asked the crowd to applaud the young man, I watched with my every breath stuck in my throat. Thank you for volunteering. This won't hurt a bit, the ringleader affirmed as he reached into his pocket. The whole time Marty stood there, smiling and bowing at the roaring crowd, he continued to scan. Then his eyes landed on me. He mouthed something that was only for me, as I sat surrounded by people I couldn't see. My eyes became hot and stingy as I read his lips, and before I knew it, my fingers that were gripping the seat tensed up. There was no time to process what was going to happen before the ringleader made his move. Pulling his hand out of the duster, he put a revolver up to Marty's head and without an ounce of hesitation, pulled the trigger. Once a spattering of red was thrown onto the dark brown circle of dirt, I could feel my body lifting from the chair. I rose, and Marty fell. He fell to the dirt at the ringleader's feet. I thought my emotions were running hot enough to evaporate the tears on my cheek as I rushed through the set of chairs offering no apologies. Even though looking at his face created an intense urge to vomit, I stormed right up to the ringleader, ready to... I honestly don't know. I was stopped before it got that far. It's okay, Andrew. My eyes were still fixated on the ringleader. His face continued to shift, but his body was unmoving. I kept my gaze on the leader, hoping he could feel what I was feeling. But out of the corner of my eye, Marty started to stir. Slowly, he rose to his feet. I couldn't see any sign of the gunshot, but the blood still rested on the ground behind him. We're fucking leaving! I scowled, being more assertive at that moment than I had ever been before. Are we free to leave? I asked the ringleader. You're free to go, Andrew. The ringleader responded through ever-changing lips, his calm voice almost a mockery of my emotions. I do hope you enjoyed your time. Those words were like a punch to the gut. Like he was so far above me that he couldn't care less about my swelling rage. Come on, Marty. I quickly turned around and began to storm out of the tent, looking over my shoulder to confirm that Marty was following me. He was, walking much slower than me, with shoulders hanging heavy. I didn't want to stop all the while as I made my way out of the tent and back to the grounds, every so often turning my head to make sure Marty was still there. The trees came into view as I shuffled through the invisible crowd that only appeared as they passed by my sides. I could feel their shoulders and arms brushing against mine. Andrew, Marty spoke behind me. We're almost out, don't worry, I replied, not even looking back to make sure that he could hear me. Andrew. His tone was the same, but quieter. No, not quite. I was just further away, like he had stopped walking. All of a sudden, my body felt like a rock. Like I was a statue that was planted into the ground and that each part of me feared to turn around. As the realization punctured my lungs like cutting knives. I could feel his presence behind me. I could feel him standing several feet back. And suddenly the night became quiet. There were a few guests in my peripheral that had stopped their meandering and stood completely still around me. Please don't, I said in a whisper to no one in particular. Perhaps a plea to the orchestrating higher powers. My face was becoming wet again. Cool streaking tears running down my face on the verge of a manic break. Andrew, it's okay. Marty's voice was soft, and his words were like a warm blanket wrapping around me on a stormy night. It reached me, Andrew. Your feelings reached me. My lead foot slipped from the patch of grass it had flattened, allowing my body to begin to pivot. I swiveled around until I had turned to face Marty. And I was alone. The lights were off, and the crowd was gone. My head became heavy as it rolled back, and my eyes closed, pushing the well of forming water out. The breath that I had been holding in my chest all of this time came out in whining spurts. My lips moved, mouthing words I couldn't even decipher. I dropped to my knees in the large empty field. It was just me. My emotions dripped off my face and watered the warm blades of grass that hugged my legs as I let it all out. In those woods is where I left my sorrow. It's where I let all of the pain seep out of my chest and become one with the forest. As the sun started to peak above the horizon, I too lifted myself up and made the hike back into town. A town that, in time, would forget Marty. His mother would pretend to care for a few days until the public eye was taken off of her. Very few people knew the kind of monster that she was to Marty after his dad passed away. Marty saw a chance to be well-fed and to see the world, to be part of a family, to do something that only a person at their lowest could accomplish. Seeing the world beyond the showmanship. There were search efforts to find him. I was put into counseling and questioning at the same time, as I was his only real connection to this town. I couldn't tell them. It would seem like a fever dream to anyone who wasn't there. But Marty, he was gone. And all I had left of him was the words he mouthed to me the final time I was able to look at him, right in the eyes. Thank you for being my friend.
Chilling tales for dark nights. Tales